Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to a new episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. There is a major controversy that has emerged out of the war in Ukraine involving accusations being traded back and forth between multiple nations about whether the United States has biological weapons programs, both in general and specifically ones that they're developing and have cultivated in partnership with the Ukrainians in Ukraine, right on the other side of the Russian border. And I think it's incredibly interesting and important controversy, not because it determines whether the Russian invasion of Ukraine is or isn't justifiable, but because the United States is making some extremely emphatic statements denying that they have any biological weapons or ever have, let alone that they have them in Ukraine. And I think it's extremely worthwhile and, in fact, necessary to determine whether the U.S. government is telling the truth in the statements that it is making. And to examine this question, I want to look through the prism of two historical events, one somewhat distant, which is the 2001 Anthrax attacks that occurred on U.S. soil shortly after the 9/11 attack, and one more recent, which is the question of whether coronavirus strains were manipulated in a lab in Wuhan in order to make them more contagious and more lethal. Both shed significant light on the denials that the United States government has spent 48 hours issuing over concerns that it has biological and chemical weapons, both in general and in Ukraine. So the controversy really began because both Russia and China for weeks have been claiming that they have evidence that the United States has biological weapons labs inside Ukraine. On March 8th, 2022, just this week, the TASS agency, the Russian news agency, published an article, quote, Ukraine worked on development of biological weapons near Russian borders. Statement, documents were obtained from employees of Ukrainian biological laboratories about emergency disposal of particularly dangerous pathogens of deadly diseases, Maria Zakharova said. So that's coming from the Russians. They've been making this claim for a long time, actually years, certainly months, but in connection with the current conflict for at least weeks, that there are seriously dangerous biological weapons labs maintained by the United States and the Ukrainians on the other side of the Russian border. The Chinese have supported the Russians in this claim. Here you see a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, also on March 8th. Quote, the U.S. has 336 labs in 30 countries under its control, including 26 in Ukraine alone. It should give a full account of its biological military activities at home and abroad and subject itself to multilateral verification. Now, it should go without saying that assertions unaccompanied by evidence from the Chinese and Russian governments should be subjected to a large amount of skepticism, should not be believed unless there's evidence presented. Justice is true of assertions unaccompanied by evidence from the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, or any other part of the U.S. government. In fact, any other government. That's our duty as journalists, as citizens, to be skeptical about assertions governments make, especially during wartime when they're very prone to disseminate propaganda, lies, disinformation, unless we're shown evidence. But this is where the debate started. Both the Chinese and the Russians are emphatic that they have evidence for the existence of these labs. Now, once this claim started emerging early on in the war, American media outlets rushed to declare it a lie, false, a conspiracy theory, even though it was impossible for these news agencies to know for certain whether there were chemical weapons labs in Ukraine or biological weapons programs in Ukraine. They pretended that they knew and published articles under their elevated, noble, supposedly neutral, and above it all title fact checkers, which is designed to make you think that this isn't an opinion column. It's not just a regular news article that you've come to. These are fact checkers. They are the ones, the arbiters of truth and falsity. So you see here from February 25th, the day after the Russians invaded Ukraine, from PolitiFact, quote, there are no U.S.-run biolabs in Ukraine, contrary to social media posts. How does PolitiFact know that? Of course they didn't know that. How would they possibly know that? How could they prove the negative? But they asserted it because it was important to the U.S. government. Here, factcheck.org, March 2nd, quote, social media posts misrepresent U.S.-Ukraine threat reduction program. There is a threat reduction program that the United States has in former Soviet republics, such as Ukraine, designed to get biological weapons and chemical weapons under control, and that's what they're referring to. But they have no idea as well whether there are active biological and chemical labs the Russians and Chinese are alleging. They just simply decreed it to be false because their allegiance is to the United States government. Here, USA Today, also on February 25th, the day after the Russian invasion, quote, fact check. False claims of U.S. biolabs in Ukraine tied to Russian disinformation campaign. Let's remember that right before the 2020 election, when the genuine documents from Hunter Biden's laptop emerged concerning Joe Biden's activities in pursuit of business opportunities in Ukraine and China, with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's brother trading on his influence, this is the same claim they made. Oh, those documents are Russian disinformation. This is what they always say when they want you to disbelieve a story. They actually have no idea. Here, from Foreign Policy, March 2nd, you see how they're all doing it at once. The first week of the war, quote, false claims of U.S. biowarfare labs in Ukraine grip QAnon. The conspiracy theory has been boosted by Russian and Chinese media and diplomats. Why was it so crucial for these quote-unquote fact-checkers, which are just journalists and reporters, pundits, pushing an ideology, masquerading as something more elevated and noble, fact-checking? Why was it so important for them to definitively assert, not that there was no evidence for these claims, but that these claims were false, when they couldn't possibly know that? Obviously, any biological weapons programs in Ukraine, in partnership with the United States or otherwise, would be highly secretive and classified. They would never tell the media. The U.S., of course, would falsely deny it if it were true. So they had no way of knowing, and yet look at them. They all, like herd animals, united and rushed to proclaim it false. Now, I didn't talk about this issue or mention this issue because I had no way of discerning who was telling the truth or lying with these competing claims, the Russian and the Chinese on one side, the Americans and the Ukrainians denying it on the other. I began talking about it. In fact, I wrote an article yesterday at Substack. I'm now doing this video only because the top official at the State Department in charge of Ukraine under both the Obama and now Biden administrations, Victoria Nuland, who notably, before working for Hillary Clinton's State Department, also was the Deputy National Security Advisor to Dick Cheney in the early part of the War on Terror, and then became George W. Bush's ambassador to NATO. She's a classic Washington neocon and warmonger and hawk. And yet you see she just kind of mutates from one administration to the next, supposedly some on the right, some on the left. She just stays in control of Ukraine, showing how Washington has a uniparty, one ideology when it comes to war. There was only one administration where she wasn't welcome, and that was the Trump administration. But the two administrations before that, the Bush and Obama administrations, and now the Biden administration, she's fully in charge of this region of the world. And she went on March 7th, so just a couple days ago, to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And she was asked about these claims by Senator Marco Rubio, who clearly expected and wanted her to simply deny them. He asked her, as you're about to see, does Ukraine have biological and chemical weapons programs? And he expected, everyone expected her to say, no, Senator, of course not. And he would then hold that up as debunking the Russian and Chinese accusations. But that's not what she said. She said something much different. Listen to what she said. Not just the first part in response to that question, but also what she added on to it. And watch their body language as well, how halting and nervous and uncertain she is. This is a person who has lots of experience, decades in Washington. She's very cocksure, aggressive, articulate, has a great facility with that kind of officialese that the State Department uses. But that completely abandons her here as Senator Rubio confronted her with this question. And it was only after her admission under oath before the Senate that you're about to hear did I start believing there was something to the story, because she said so.
I have a minute left. Let me ask you, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've uncovered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
First of all, it's so almost hilarious how often they make these claims about Russia. They take extremely common human behaviors, such as whataboutism, which is nothing more than if somebody accuses you of doing something, you point to the accuser's bad acts as a way of equalizing you to them, or just everyone does that. That's very common in international relations and human behavior. And yet they'll constantly claim, oh, whataboutism is a unique specialty of the Soviets and now the Russians, as though nobody else does this. It was like invented in some sophisticated lab. The idea that if someone accuses you of something, you point out that they actually do it too. They always say, oh, this is a Russian specialty, tradecraft of Russia. That's what she's saying here too. She's talking about just projection, that whatever you do, you accuse others of doing. That's a very common psychological dynamic. Sigmund Freud and Jung and all kinds of psychologists have talked about this at length, have written about it. But in her mind, this is a classic Russian tactic to accuse the other guy of what you're doing. But what's most notable here, you see how Senator Rubio interrupted her as she was doing something very uncharacteristic for her and for neocons and for senior U.S. foreign policy officials. She was, for some reason, telling a version of the truth. He obviously was extremely alarmed that she didn't say no when asked, does Ukraine have biological and chemical weapons? She instead said they have biological research facilities. Now, that is a vague phrase. What are biological research facilities? It would have been possible, had she stopped there, to claim that, oh, they're just like very benign, almost like high school level chemistry labs. They have a few like Bunsen burners and flasks. And they just kind of research. They like pour vinegar into water and watch it explode the way 11th graders do. The problem is for the U.S. government is she didn't stop there. She went on and she said, whatever is in these biological research labs is so dangerous that the U.S. government is gravely concerned about the possibility that it would fall into Russian hands, that Russian forces would acquire them as they approach. And she said for that reason, the U.S. government is working closely with the Ukrainians to secure these facilities to make sure that Russian forces, they don't fall into Russian hands. Why would she be concerned about these biological research facilities in Ukraine falling into Russian hands unless what's in these facilities is very dangerous? That they either are weapons or it can easily be converted into weapons. That's the obvious question that emerges from what she, in very halting, uncertain terms, said. You can speculate about why she told the truth. My guess is she was telling the truth when she said we're actively working right this minute with the Ukrainians to make sure these labs are secured. And so when Senator Rubio asked her, does Ukraine have biological and chemical weapons, she didn't want to lie in that moment in front of a open hearing. It was in her mind that she's working on these labs, and so she told the truth inadvertently. Whatever her motives are, you can just speculate about that. She said what she said, which is not just that they have these research labs, biological research labs, but that they are sufficiently dangerous that they are very gravely concerned, very worried that they will fall into Russian hands, leading to the question, what is in these biological research labs that makes them so dangerous that you would be afraid of them falling into Russian hands? Now, obviously the Russians and the Chinese seized on this testimony. A lot of journalists, maybe not a lot, but some, including me, wrote about it and reported on it. And so people went to the U.S. government. They said, What is she talking about? What's going on here? Do you, in fact, have biological weapons programs? Remember, that was Senator Rubio's question. In Ukraine? And so the U.S. government had to come out and emphatically deny that they have biological weapons of any kind, let alone that they have them in Ukraine. Here's from a long multi-tweet thread from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who sometimes appears more like the president than the press secretary, but she went onto Twitter and she wrote, quote, "We took note of Russia's false claims about alleged U.S. biological weapons labs and chemical weapons development in Ukraine. We've also seen Chinese officials echo these conspiracy theories." She went on, quote, "The United States is in full compliance with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention and does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere. Quote, it's Russia that has a long and well-documented track record of using chemical weapons, including in attempted assassinations and poisoning of Putin's political enemies like Alexei Navalny. Now that Russia has made these false claims and China has seemingly endorsed this propaganda, we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine and to create a false flag operation using them. It's a clear pattern." That is an extremely dangerous prediction, that Russia is now about to use biological or chemical weapons inside Ukraine, that they will claim that it comes from the Ukrainians in the United States. The United States will claim that it actually comes from Russia. You're talking about a weapons of mass destruction attack on European soil where both sides are going to dispute who is responsible. She's predicting basically that that will happen. But I think it's really important to understand how eager the government was to deny this. Here is Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby, who similarly stated, quote, "We are not developing biological or chemical weapons inside Ukraine. This is textbook Russian propaganda." The State Department got into the act. They posted this statement on Twitter, quote, "Fact, the United States does not have chemical and biological weapons labs in Ukraine." And then they added, "The U.S. is in full compliance with its obligations under the Biological Weapons Convention and does not develop or possess chemical and biological weapons anywhere." Here's the State Department, the Kremlin's allegations of chemical and biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. They said it does not own or operate any chemical or biological labs in Ukraine. It's in full compliance with these treaties. It does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere. It is Russia that has such programs, and they're in violation of the conventions. So that's the U.S. government's position. We do not ever have chemical or biological weapons. We're in full compliance with the treaties that ban any country from developing chemical or biological weapons, and it's Russia, the Russians, that do that, not us. Now, is the U.S. government telling the truth? We don't know. Possibly they are, and possibly they're not. And that's what I want to examine with you by looking first at what happened with the 2001 anthrax attacks, because it shines a huge amount of light on whether the U.S. government is telling the truth in issuing these statements. A lot of you probably are too young to really remember the 2001 anthrax attacks. Some of you who lived through that extremely traumatizing and turbulent time in the weeks after 9/11 probably have your memories faded about it or have forgotten about it. So I just want to walk through. It's an incredibly fascinating event with a lot of mystery surrounding it still. I spent 2 or 3 years reporting heavily on the anthrax attacks, and I just want to show you some of the really pertinent parts that illuminate the question of whether the U.S. government is telling the truth here. So here is an article from the New York Times, October 12th, 2001. So just a month after the 9/11 attacks. Quote, "Anthrax found in NBC News aid. An assistant to the NBC anchor, Tom Brokaw, has tested positive for anthrax infection more than 2 weeks after she opened a threatening letter addressed to Mr. Brokaw that contained a white powder," officials said yesterday. Now, it is impossible to overstate the significance of the anthrax attacks on the mindset and psyche of the American public. Obviously, 9/11 was an incredibly traumatizing event. 3,000 Americans died. It was done in spectacular fashion. But for a lot of Americans, they looked at it and they saw that it was actually isolated in power centers in Washington and New York. And therefore, people who lived in other parts of the country could maintain some psychological distance. The anthrax attacks changed all of that. They were highly weaponized strains of anthrax, not the kind that occur in nature, but manipulated in labs, highly, highly sophisticated science that weaponized them. And they were sent through the mailboxes to numerous prominent figures like Tom Brokaw, like Senator Tom Daschle, and many others. It ended up killing 5 people, people who worked at the post office, people who just ran into the anthrax in the course of its travel. And it convinced people, this is like James Bond stuff now, and it's not just people who live in New York and Washington. It's actually coming right through our mailboxes, like the most sacred place of American suburbia. Everybody felt threatened by this, really unsettled. You cannot overstate the importance of the anthrax attacks. And what was so alarming about them was that the U.S. government was saying this is not naturally occurring anthrax. Somebody manipulated it into a weapon, into a biological weapon. That's what made it so scary. Here was the letter that accompanied at least several of the envelopes containing the anthrax. Here's the one to Tom Brokaw. Quote, it's dated September 11, 2001, obviously intended in the public mind to link it to 9/11. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. Obviously intending to create the impression that the same people who perpetrated 9/11 were the ones behind the anthrax attacks. Now, here is a video clip from ABC News on October 15, 2001, just to give you a sense for what was in the air about these anthrax attacks. For those of you who don't remember it, those of you who didn't live through it, look how terrifying this was.
From where that was mailed.
Also today, anthrax was discovered in the Boca Raton post office in Florida that handled mail for the American Media Company, where one person died from anthrax. A senior federal health official told ABC News the strain of anthrax found in Florida is confirmed as the so-called AIM strain, a strain originally cultivated in Iowa but used in research laboratories around the world. Leading authorities on biological agents say the AIM strain strongly suggests a sophisticated operation. At the White House, President Bush was asked if there is a connection to Osama bin Laden.
We're making sure that we connect any dots that we have to find out who's doing this. And I wouldn't put it past him, but we don't.
Now, you hear there, that the only thing we knew for sure is that somebody weaponized this strain. This was a biological weapon. We didn't know who did it. They were obviously suggesting it was Osama bin Laden, but there was no proof. But there you see George Bush at least giving credence to that theory. But what happened almost immediately after was that leaks started coming from the government through the media, through ABC News specifically, designed to blame Saddam Hussein for the anthrax, claiming that they did an analysis on the anthrax and discovered the presence of a clay substance called bentonite, which they tried to imply was some incredibly nefarious substance. In reality, it's just the clay that's used in cat litter. It's incredibly common. But they tried to claim that only Iraq uses bentonite in their anthrax biological weapons program, leading Americans to believe that it was Iraq that was responsible. This was put into the ether for at least a week in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Here you see from Peter Jennings, the then anchor of ABC World News Tonight on October 26th, he went on the air and this is what he said, quote, ABC News has learned what made the anthrax so dangerous in the letter to Senator Tom Daschle was a particular additive, which only one country, as far as we know, that's a very important caveat, only one country, as far as we know, has used to produce biological weapons. He then had Brian Ross, the now fired investigative reporter, on ABC News Tonight, and this is what he said, quote, the discovery of bentonite came in an urgent series of tests conducted at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and elsewhere. This is what bentonite looks like under a microscope, a substance which helps keeps the tiny anthrax particles floating in the air by preventing them from sticking together. It is possible, said Brian Ross, other countries may be using it too, but it is a trademark of Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program. Now, here you see the Weekly Standard, which is the neocon rag that was run at the time by Bill Kristol and Stephen F. Hayes, who wrote a book claiming that Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda had an alliance together, that Saddam was personally involved in 9/11, is what that implied. They were neocon central. Stephen Hayes, who wrote that book full of lies and disinformation and propaganda, was just hired by NBC News. Here's an article from them on November 12th, immediately praising ABC News for blaming it on Saddam Hussein. Surprisingly, good guys and more. This was a neocon scheme to blame the sophisticated attack on Iraq because they, even before 9/11, had designs on overthrowing Saddam Hussein. Quote, on the critical issue of who sent the anthrax, it's time to give credit to the ABC website, abcnews.com, for reporting rings around most other news organizations. This is what the Weekly Standard said. Here's a bit from a comprehensive story filed late last week by Gary Matsumoto, lending further credence to the commonsensical theory resisted by the White House that Al-Qaeda or Iraq, and not some domestic Ted Kaczynski type, is behind the germ warfare. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas. Oh, this is George Bush at a time when David Frum was his speechwriter in the State of the Union address just a month later, blaming Iraq as well. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. So you see this movement into 2002 to take what is clearly a biological weapons attack and blame it on Iraq. Now, as it turned out, ABC News admitted a week after disseminating it all over the place, John McCain went on David Letterman, the first David Letterman show after 9/11, and said, we believe the anthrax attacks came from Iraq. ABC News eventually acknowledged that their sources got that wrong, that there was no bentonite discovered in the anthrax, and that there's no indication that it came from Iraq. They admitted that, but the damage was done. It's all in the air, blaming anthrax on Iraq. And so the question became, who launched this biological weapons attack on American soil? It is absolutely development of biological weapons that was launched on American soil. Now, as I said, it's hard to overstate the impact that anthrax had. People remember that 9/11 is what caused the trauma, but the anthrax attacks really, that's what got Americans so unraveled. Here's an article by the Washington Post longtime columnist Richard Cohen. He's always been their token liberal, but he was adamantly in favor of the Iraq War. When Colin Powell went and made his presentation to the UN, he famously or notoriously wrote, after seeing Colin Powell's evidence, only a fool or a Frenchman would doubt that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And here he is in 2004 admitting he got that wrong and describing why. Listen to what he said. Quote, anthrax played a role in my decision to support the Bush administration's desire to take out Saddam Hussein. I linked him to anthrax, which I linked to September 11th. I was not going to stand by and simply wait for another attack, more attacks. I was going to go to the source, Hussein, and get him before he could get us. As time went on, I became more and more questioning, but I had a hard time backing down from my initial whoop and holler for war. That's an amazing admission that he, the Washington Post columnist for foreign policy, believed that it was Saddam Hussein who was behind both the 9/11 attacks and the anthrax attacks. Here he was in 2008 in Slate, once again revisiting and doing a mea culpa for all the columns he wrote cheering on the Iraq War, entitled, How Did I Get Iraq Wrong? Listen to what he said about the anthrax attacks. It's always been so mysterious to me. Listen, he's explaining why he supported Iraq, the war in Iraq. Quote, anthrax. Remember anthrax? It seems no one does anymore. At least it's never mentioned. But right after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, letters laced with anthrax were received at the New York Post and Tom Brokaw's office at NBC. In the following days, more anthrax-contaminated letters were received by other news organizations, CBS News and presumably ABC, where traces of anthrax were found in the newsroom. Weirdly, even The Sun, a supermarket tabloid, also got a letter, and a photo editor, Bob Stevens, was fatally infected. Other letters were sent to Senator Tom Daschle's office. In Washington, D.C., a postal worker, Thomas L. Morris Jr., died. There were ample reason to be afraid. The attacks, he said, were not entirely unexpected. I had been told after September 11th to secure Cipro, the antidote to anthrax. The tip had come in a roundabout way from a high government official, and I immediately acted on it. I was carrying Cipro way before most people had ever heard of it. For this and other reasons, the anthrax letter appeared linked to the awful events of September 11th that all seemed one and the same. That is a longtime, highly connected Washington Post columnist who lives in Washington admitting that before the anthrax attacks, he was warned by a high government official that he should use Cipro, which is the antidote to anthrax. And he admits that he walked around carrying it because of that. He didn't tell anybody. He kept that to himself, quite selfishly. But that was a critical factor in why America was so willing to go to war. Not the fact that it happened only on American soil, a biological weapons attack, but the question of who to blame. Now, as it turned out, the U.S. government didn't know for years who was behind that. They originally pursued a U.S. Army scientist, Stephen Hatfill, and made public their suspicions about him, ruining his reputation. They ultimately admitted he was not the anthrax attacker. He sued and won millions of dollars from the U.S. government. But on August 6, 2008, the U.S. government and the FBI did a press conference announcing that they had discovered the real anthrax attacker. And according to the FBI, not according to me, according to the FBI, still to this very day, the biological weapons that were unleashed on American soil in the form of weaponized anthrax came not from Al-Qaeda and not from Saddam Hussein, but came from a U.S. Army lab in Fort Detrick, unleashed by an infectious disease scientist named Bruce Ivins, who worked in the U.S. Army lab, where he cultivated this weaponized version of anthrax, a biological weapon. And then before they could arrest him, he killed himself, says the FBI, which means they never had to prove the case against him in a court beyond a reasonable doubt. But listen to the FBI's own explanation of how this biological weapon that the U.S. government says we never develop, we never possess, it's a violation of the treaties, was in fact being developed in a U.S. Army lab under the supervision of Dr. Fauci. Not saying he was involved, but that is true. That these biological weapons, highly sophisticated and lethal, were manipulated and built in a U.S. Army lab by U.S. Army scientists.
A 7-year mystery solved.
We are confident that Dr. Ivins was the only person responsible for these attacks.
The government has released dozens of documents it says prove Army microbiologist Bruce Ivins was behind the 2001 anthrax attacks that killed 5 and chilled a nation. Among them, one alleging Ivins had sole custody of highly purified anthrax spores with certain genetic mutations identical to the poison from the attacks. Another saying he was not able to give a good enough explanation for late lab work hours around the time of the attacks, painting a picture of a deeply troubled genius bordering on desperation at being caught, and who killed himself as authorities closed in.
We stand here today firmly convinced that we have the person who committed those attacks, and we are confident that had this gone to trial, we would have proved him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
It's quite a claim that not only did this person who they are certain acted completely alone in this attack that played such an important role in enabling the Iraq War, gosh darn it, he killed himself right as we were about to arrest him. So that means we never can and have to prove the case against him in court. Our evidence will never be tested. It'll never be cross-examined. We'll never have to give any evidence that we don't want you to see, because that would be our obligation if it went to trial. But we want to assure you, we know, we have high amounts of confidence that it came from the U.S. Army lab. Now, if you believe them, what that means is that the U.S. government developed biological weapons, and a scientist working for that government used that weaponized anthrax and unleashed the biological weapons attack on American soil. Now, the reality, though, is that there was a huge amount of doubt about whether the FBI was telling the truth, whether the FBI's case was actually persuasive. And it didn't come from the fringes of the internet. It came from the most mainstream sources. In 2011, as I said, I had spent years reporting on this anthrax case. I wrote an article headlined, quote, "Serious doubt cast on FBI's anthrax case against Bruce Ivins. A scientific panel concludes the government overstated its genetic evidence against Bruce Ivins." So the FBI finally released its evidence for independent evaluation. The panel of independent scientists released a report saying that the genetic evidence on which the FBI was relying to link the attacks to Dr. Ivins was not nearly as dispositive or concrete or persuasive as they claimed. And that led to widespread doubt among the most mainstream outlets about whether the FBI really had solved the case. Here from my article, I wrote, quote, From the start, it was obvious that the FBI's case against Ivins was barely more persuasive than its case against Hatfield had been. The allegations were entirely circumstantial. There was no direct evidence tying Ivins to the mailings, and there were huge glaring holes in both the FBI's evidentiary and scientific claims. So dubious was the FBI's case that even the nation's most establishment media organs, which instinctively trust federal law enforcement agencies, expressed serious doubts and called for an independent investigation. That included, among others, the editorial pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And my article contains links to all three of those newspapers editorializing that far more investigation is needed because the case is far from persuasive. I went on and wrote, quote, mainstream scientific sources were equally skeptical. The journal Nature called for an independent investigation and declared in its editorial headline, quote, case not closed. While Dr. Alan Pearson, director of the Biological and Chemical Weapons Control Program at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation, representative of numerous experts in the field, expressed many scientific doubts and also demanded a full and independent investigation. Now, just to see how mainstream these doubts were about the FBI's case, here you see ProPublica, the investigative outlet, on October 10th, 2011, with its article, quote, new evidence adds doubt to FBI's case against anthrax suspect. The FBI still insists it has the right man in Bruce Ivins, an Army biologist who committed suicide in 2008 before being charged. But an in-depth look by ProPublica, PBS, and McClatchy found new evidence challenging the government's claims. The article went on, quote, newly available documents and the accounts of Ivins' former colleagues have shed fresh light on the evidence, and while they don't exonerate Ivins, are at odds with some of the science and circumstantial evidence that the government said would have convicted him of capital crimes. Quote, even some of the government's science consultants wonder whether the real killer is at large. Now, what we know for sure, as I wrote in 2008, is that at the very least, if the government is correct, it means that someone lied to ABC News when they said that they found the presence of bentonite and that was highly suggested that it was linked to Iraq. ABC News, despite acknowledging that those sources lied to them, causing them to disseminate false reports for over a week, highly damaging and influential false reports, to this day refuses to tell us who inside the government linked these anthrax attacks to Iraq when now the FBI says it's certain it came from a U.S. Army lab. Now, let me just emphasize how serious of a biological weapon this was, developed in this U.S. Army lab. PBS Frontline, in October of 2011, devoted an entire 1-hour documentary to examining this case. And they highlighted a scientist, Dr. Paul Keim, who was the one who discovered in late 2001 that this was the AIM strain, one of the most terrifying and sophisticated strains of anthrax known to humankind. Not everybody can weaponize anthrax into the AIM strain. It takes very sophisticated scientists. And you see there him saying, we were surprised it was the AIM strain. Here's from Frontline, quote, in October 2001, Northern Arizona University microbiologist Dr. Paul Keim identified that the anthrax used in the attack letters was the AIM strain, a development he described as, quote, chilling, because that particular strain was developed in U.S. government laboratories. Here's Dr. Keim, quote, we were surprised it was the AIM strain, and it was chilling at the same time because the AIM strain is a laboratory strain that had been developed by the U.S. Army as a vaccine challenge strain. We knew that it was highly virulent. In fact, that's why the Army used it, because it represented a more potent challenge to vaccines that were being developed by the U.S. Army. It wasn't just some random type of anthrax that you find in nature. It was a laboratory strain, and that was very significant to us because that was the first hint that this might really be a bioterrorism event. Now, in what he's saying, what we find is the semantic game playing the United States does about whether or not it has a biological weapons program. The conventions and treaties that the United States, along with dozens of other countries, sign that ban the development of biological weapons have an exception. One of those exceptions is you're allowed to develop biological weapons if your purpose is not to use them, but to study them in order to develop vaccines in case somebody uses them on you. Now, the reason why this is semantic is because it's only about motive. The actual work in the laboratory is exactly the same. If you wanted to develop a biological weapon, you would do exactly what this U.S. Army lab in Fort Detrick was doing. You would weaponize anthrax into this highly weaponized and fatal, lethal strain that's very fine in its cultivation. And then the only thing you say at the end is, well, we're not in violation of the treaty, even though we have developed a biological weapon, because our motive is not to use it, simply to study it. That, of course, is what was done with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that we know for certain manipulated coronavirus strains to make them both more lethal and more contagious. And their argument is, we weren't engaged in biological weapons research. We were only manipulating this virus to study how we could develop vaccines and treatments against it. But it's the same thing. It's the same kind of weapon. It is a weapon when you manipulate a coronavirus strain to become more lethal and more contagious, regardless of your motive. But this is how the U.S. government looks you in the eye and says, we have never had a biological weapons program, even though the FBI's own version of events is that highly weaponized anthrax is developed inside of a U.S. lab, and not just developed there, but deployed on U.S. soil against the American people. Now, this is a fascinating article that I just want to walk you through that gives the full insight into how this really works. This is an article in the New York Times on September 4th, 2001. So it's exactly 1 week before the September 11th attacks. And it's an incredibly significant article, but because it happened a week before September 11th, nobody remembers it. It was written by New York Times reporter Judy Miller, who ended up discredited for her gullible reporting about Saddam's biological and chemical weapons program. But at the time, she was considered the foremost journalistic expert in the question of biological and chemical weapons. And she published an article warning that what the U.S. was doing in its own research into germ warfare pushes the limits of the treaty that Jen Psaki and John Kirby and the State Department cited to say, we always abide by this. This is the New York Times in 2001 saying many specialists inside the U.S. government believe that this treaty is starting to get violated by the development of biological and chemical weapons inside the U.S. government. Listen to this article. Quote, over the past several years, the United States has embarked on a program of secret research on biological weapons. The United States has embarked on a program of secret research on biological weapons that, some officials say, tests the limits of the global treaty banning such weapons. The 1972 treaty forbids nations from developing or acquiring weapons that spread disease, but it allows work on vaccines and other protective measures. Government officials said the secret research, which mimicked the major steps a state or terrorist would take to create a biological arsenal, was aimed at a better understanding of the threat. So they're admitting they do exactly the same thing as a terrorist organization or a rogue government like Russia or China would do when developing biological weapons. They're doing exactly the same thing, but you're supposed to think it's fine because their motive is pure and benign and not malicious or destructive. But the New York Times article said, quote, the projects, which have never been previously disclosed, were begun under President Clinton and have been embraced by the Bush administration, which intends to expand them. Earlier this year, administration officials said, the Pentagon drew up plans to engineer genetically a potentially more potent variant of the bacterium that causes anthrax, a deadly disease ideal for germ warfare. A warning 7 days before the 9/11 attacks about the dangerous and potentially illegal work the U.S. government, the CIA, and Army labs were doing to develop a more potent variant of anthrax. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union produced vast quantities of germ weapons, enough to kill everyone on Earth. Eager to halt the spread of what many called the poor man's atom bomb, the United States unilaterally gave up germs arms and helped lead the global campaign to abolish them. By 1975, most of the world nations had signed the convention. In doing so, they agreed not to develop, produce, acquire, or stockpile quantities or types of germs that had no, quote, prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. They also pledged not to develop or obtain weapons or other equipment, quote, designed to use such agents or toxins for hostile purposes or in armed conflict. But there were at least two significant loopholes. The pact did not define, quote, defensive research or say what studies might be prohibited, if any, and it provides no means of catching cheaters. Among the facilities likely to be open to inspection under the draft agreement would be the West Jefferson, Ohio laboratory of the Battelle Memorial Institute, a military contractor that has been selected to create the genetically altered anthrax. Several officials who served in senior posts in the Clinton administration acknowledged that the secretive efforts were so poorly coordinated that even the White House was unaware of their full scope. The Pentagon's project to build a germ warfare factory was not reported to the White House, they said. President Clinton, who developed an intense interest in germ weapons, was never briefed on the program underway or contemplated. A former senior official in the Clinton White House conceded that in retrospect, someone should have been responsible for reviewing the projects to ensure they were not only effective in defending the United States, but consistent with the nation's arms control pledges. The CIA's test on the bomb model touched off a dispute about government experts after the tests were concluded in 2000, with some officials arguing that they violated the germ treaty's prohibition against developing weapons. Intelligence officials said lawyers at the agency, the CIA, and the White House concluded that the work was defensive and therefore allowed, but even officials who supported the effort acknowledged that it brought the United States closer to what was forbidden. It was pressing how far you could go before you do something illegal or immoral, recalled one senior official who was briefed on the program. So we know from the anthrax attacks and from this incredible New York Times article the week before 9/11 that the United States government was absolutely developing biological and chemical weapons. Their justification was that they had good motives secretly in their head, but the work itself is exactly identical. So when the U.S. government insists emphatically we do not develop biological weapons, understand that that is perfectly consistent with having labs to develop biological weapons. As long as they believe our goal is not to unleash them or deploy them or use them in attacks, just to study them, they can have biological weapons that they built and still tell you they don't have a biological weapons program and believe they're telling the truth. That's how much game playing there is going on with these denials. Now, as I said, it's very similar, not just to the 9/11, the anthrax attack and what happened with the U.S. Army lab and with this prior pre-9/11 research, but also with what happened with COVID. Here is an article from the Intercept, the outlet I co-created and then resigned from in 2020. They actually did a good job. They filed a FOIA request for all the materials that shed light on whether the U.S. was really, what kind of programs the U.S. was funding in China regarding the coronavirus. Now, my view and my belief is that they did this because they wanted to exonerate Dr. Fauci. This was done at a time when there were a lot of claims being made by Senator Rand Paul and others that Dr. Fauci had funded Chinese research that was designed to manipulate the coronavirus to make it more lethal and more contagious, gain-of-function research, which Dr. Fauci denied. And I believe the goal of the Intercept in this FOIA request is to get these documents to show, no, look, the right wing is lying again. Dr. Fauci is correct. That's not the kind of research that was being funded by the U.S. What they discovered instead was exactly the opposite. And to their credit, I guess, they told the truth about what these documents revealed. It was exactly the opposite. It was that the U.S. was indeed working with the Chinese scientists to manipulate coronavirus strains. Quote, newly released documents provide details of U.S.-funded research on several types of coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. The Intercept has obtained more than 900 pages of documents detailing the work of EcoHealth Alliance, a U.S.-based health organization that used federal money to fund that coronavirus research at the Chinese laboratory. The trove of documents includes 2 previously unpublished grant proposals that were funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, as well as project updates relating to EcoHealth Alliance research, which has been scrutinized amid increased interest in the origins of the pandemic. Quote, this is a roadmap to the high-risk research that could have led to the current pandemic, said Gary Raskin, executive director of U.S. Right to Know, a group that is investigating the origins of COVID-19. One of the grants, titled Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence, outlines an ambitious effort led by EcoHealth Alliance President Peter Daszak to screen thousands of bat samples for novel coronaviruses. The research also involves screening people who work with live animals. The documents contain several critical details about the research in Wuhan, including the fact that key experimental work with humanized mice was conducted at a biosafety level 3 lab at Wuhan University Center for American Animal Experiments, and not the Wuhan Institute of Virology as was previously assumed. The documents raise additional questions about the theory that the pandemic may have begun in a lab accident, an idea that Daszak has aggressively dismissed. The Bat Coronavirus Grant provided EcoHealth System Alliance with a total of $3.1 million, including $599,000 that the Wuhan Institute of Virology used in part to identify and alter bat coronaviruses likely to infect humans. Even before the pandemic, many scientists were concerned about the potential dangers associated with such experiments. The grant proposal acknowledges some of these dangers. Quote, fieldwork involves the highest risk of exposure to SARS or other coronaviruses while working in caves with high bat density overhead and the potential for fecal dust to be inhaled. We don't know for certain to this very day whether the coronavirus was zoonotic and made a natural leap from other species to humans, or whether it leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The Biden administration says it doesn't know and is still investigating. But what we do know is that the Chinese Institute, the Institute of Virology in Wuhan, working with EcoHealth Alliance and with funding from Dr. Fauci, manipulated and altered the coronavirus to make it more lethal and more fatal, which is a biological weapon by definition. Again, their argument is that doesn't violate the treaty because our intentions are good. We're just doing it. We're developing biological weapons in order to study and create vaccines and treatments, but we still know that they have in their hands what can be used as biological weapons. So when Victoria Nuland goes before the Senate and tells Marco Rubio, in response to being asked whether Ukraine has biological and chemical weapons programs, and she doesn't say no, but instead says they have, quote, biological research facilities that are so dangerous we're deeply worried about them falling into Russian hands, that strongly suggests that that research can be used to create biological weapons, if not, in fact, this lab already containing biological weapons. Either they're dual purpose, can be used for research or weapons, or they're actually weaponized. Otherwise, why would she be so worried? And when the U.S. government comes out and emphatically denies that they have a biological weapons program, all they mean is that they don't have weapons with the wedded intention to use them. It doesn't mean they don't have these weapons and that these labs aren't biological weapons labs. Now, just to conclude, I want you to listen to this minute excerpt from a TED Talk by Andrew Weber, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs in October 2017, who described what he said were his years-long work at getting under control all of the different biological and chemical weapons in former Soviet republics, including Kazakhstan and Ukraine and other former Soviet republics. And in this clip, he describes the anthrax programs that were in Ukraine. And again, he's saying we did something heroic. We worked with the Soviet republics to get them under control. But he's also acknowledging, at least as of 2017, the existence of active anthrax programs in Ukraine. Listen to what he says.
The threat. Here I am in Kiev, Ukraine, with a brand new junior senator from Illinois. It's at a public health laboratory, and he looks concerned. And it's because from this kitchen-like refrigerator behind me, the director of the health lab handed me this tray with vials of Bacillus anthracis. That's the bacteria that causes anthrax. And we mapped many facilities like this throughout the Soviet Union. We were concerned that groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS could get their hands on these seed materials, starter cultures, to develop biological weapons for terrorist attacks. And we had a big program to consolidate and secure these dangerous pathogen collections, some of which had been left over from the Soviet biological weapons program.
Now, again, his point is the same as the State Department's. Oh, we do work with biological weapons programs in former Soviet republics like Ukraine, but our only goal when doing so is to secure them, shut them down, take them out of there. And we succeeded. But again, that leads to the question, which has not been answered, about why it is that Victoria Nuland says that these biological weapons, these biological research facilities are so dangerous that she's worried deeply that they would fall into Russian hands, and we're working to secure them. What would be in those labs in 2022 in Ukraine, right on the other side of the Russian border, that would be so dangerous that you would be worried about that? We can't say for certain whether the Russians and the Chinese on the one hand or the US and the Ukrainians on the other are telling the truth about whether there are biological weapons programs or biological labs in Ukraine. We know for certain, because Victoria Nuland said it, that there are biological research facilities there. And while we don't know what she meant, we know that those are very dangerous. That's why they're worried about it falling into Russian hands. And the point of all of this is that we should know. We have to know. Not, again, because it would mean that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is justifiable if it turns out the US and the Ukrainians are working together on biological weapons, but it would certainly mean that the US government's denials are false, and we should know what it is that the US government is doing, both in Ukraine and generally, when it comes to the deeply consequential question of whether the US government is developing biological and chemical weapons.